So far, where have we gotten to? We started summarizing what general equilibrium was. We saw that Irving Fisher of Yale reinvented general equilibrium in order to study finance. And we saw that just by reinterpreting the variables of general equilibrium, we could start to say a lot of things about finance. And in particular, we had the idea of free markets, an argument in favor of free markets. We had the idea of arbitrage and no arbitrage. So you could deduce a lot of prices without solving for the whole equilibrium just by knowing what other prices are. And we also learned that the price of many things is going to have to do with the utility and marginal utilities of people, and that's going to have a lot to do with what their impatience is and whether they're rich people or poor people, who, redistributions of wealth. Who's got the money and how impatient the people who have the money are. So those are the basic lessons that we're going to now carry into the course. And so for several lectures now, I'm going to leave the abstract theory of general equilibrium and start teaching you some of the basic vocabulary of finance that you have to know and that everybody in finance knows, like what is a mortgage, what's an annuity, and stuff like that. So before I go there, though, I want to remind you of what Irving Fisher had done. So of what Shakespeare had done 300 years before Irving Fisher. So Irving Fisher, remember, he cleared up the confusion of what interest was. He said interest is crystallized impatience. It's not some horribly unjust thing. It's not, as Marx thought, exploitation. But Shakespeare had discovered all this 300 years before. Now, when I was your age, or a little bit younger than you in high school, we all had to read The Merchant of Venice. I have two Indian co-authors and who are vaguely my age, maybe a little bit older, but anyway, they grew up in India, and they had to learn The Merchant of Venice. And actually, they learned it a lot better than I did. They both have memorized The Merchant of Venice. They can recite almost the entire thing by heart. And, but anyway, when I was in high school, it was completely typical to study The Merchant of Venice. I wonder how many of you have actually read it. Who's read The Merchant of Venice? Okay, well, whoa, this is Yale. I'm shocked. Okay, so a quarter of you have read it. Well, I recommend to the other 3/4 that you do read it. Now, when it's taught nowadays, especially at Yale, it's taught as a love story and a commentary on anti-Semitism. Now, of course, it's both. It is a love story and a commentary on anti-Semitism. Shylock the lender is Jewish, and remember what we heard about the great religions. You know, they were all forbidding lending at interest except for Judaism, which let you loan money at interest to non-Jews. So Shakespeare, who's the money lender, is Jewish and lending it to Christians. And that plays a big role in the play. And you know what happens to them, and you know what people say about Judaism is a big element of the story. But the way the play is read now, that's the whole story. And I don't think it's the whole story. In fact, I think it's quite an unimportant part of the story. I think the heart of the story is Shakespeare's commentary on economics. And so I'm going to try and argue in the next 10 minutes that Shakespeare was not only a great writer, a great psychologist, but a great economist. And you're going to see that almost all the elements of the course are in this play, and that if you read it the way I think you should read it, it should be obvious that it's really about economics and not about love. So how do you know that? Well, the very first line of the play, Antonio walks in and he says, "In sooth, I know not why I'm so sad." And there's an interlocutor, a minor character, whose name I've forgotten, Solario or something, says, "Well, it must be that you're so nervous, you know. You've got all your riches are on these boats, and they're at risk. And so anyone who had so much money at risk on boats would naturally be nervous and therefore maybe depressed." And Antonio says, "No, no, no, no. I'm not worried about the boats because every boat is on a different ocean. And so I'm not worried, you know. They're at a different ocean and they're sailing at different times. I'm not worried about my boats." And so then the interlocutor says, "Well, then you must be worried about love." And he says, "No, no, that's not it at all." So what do we see at the very beginning of the play? It's business first, love second. And secondly, he understands diversification. Okay, so now, what is the plot of the play? Bassanio, who Harold Bloom, so it happens that I went to talk to Harold Bloom. I saw him in the Whitney Humanities Center. One of Yale's greatest scholars, and among, he's sort of a polymath. He knows about everything, but including about Shakespeare, and he is a much advertised photographic memory. So I happened to run into him at the Whitney Humanities Center, actually in the men's room of the Whitney Humanities Center, and I asked, while we were there, I asked him about the Merchant of Venice and whether he happened to remember the rate of interest that Shylock ends up charging Antonio. And he said, "Dear boy, I remember almost everything, but that I've forgotten." It was so unimportant to him that he didn't even remember the rate of interest. So, but he said, "I happen to be lecturing about the Merchant of Venice in my class this afternoon." So I went and heard his lecture on the Merchant of Venice. So Bassanio, who's one of the heroes of the play, according to Harold Bloom, is a complete loser. He's the one who needs the money to woo Porsha, who's this beautiful woman living outside of Venice. And so he's got to borrow a huge amount of money. So when he enters, he's described as a Venetian, a scholar, and a soldier. Now, whenever Shakespeare says a scholar and a soldier, sometimes it's not a Venetian, when he says that, the guy's always a great guy. So this occurs repeatedly so anyway, Bassanio comes in as a star. He's a Venetian, a scholar, a soldier. What more can you want to be? And so he needs the money to woo Porsha, and he's got a business plan to do it. He's tried wooing her before, and it's come to nothing, and he's lost his money. But he says, if you shoot an arrow and you lose it, shoot an arrow again the same way, and then follow the second arrow more closely, and you'll figure out where the first arrow goes. So he's a man on a business venture with a business plan. So here's Bassanio, and here's Shylock and Antonio. Now, he needs 3,000 ducats, and he doesn't have any collateral or anything, and so he goes to Antonio, who's an older man, and according to Harold Bloom, there's some potential gay relationship, and maybe they're lovers and maybe they're not lovers, and that's half the lecture. Anyway, so Shylock lends the money, 3,000 ducats, and it's so much money he has to borrow it from another money lender named Tubal, who's even richer than he is. Okay, so they argue over what the interest rate's got to be. And so Antonio says, oh dear, I've forgotten to change, so this is out of order. So they argue over what the interest rate should be, and Antonio and Shylock make this argument. Antonio says, it's disgusting that you want to charge me interest. I mean, good Christians never charge interest. I'm appalled at you. It's because you're Jewish you're charging me interest. So he's throwing epithets and insults at Shylock, but really he just wants a low interest rate. And so Antonio says, Shylock, I would neither borrow nor lend by taking or giving interest, but to supply the ripe wants of my friend, I'll break a custom. So, ripe wants of my friend. That's saying because Bassanio was so impatient to get his hands on the money to find, Porsha, she's going to get married if he doesn't hurry up and marry her himself, because of his impatience, he's willing to pay a high rate of interest. And Shylock says, you're always complaining about me that I charge interest, and I've left out a whole bunch of stuff, but, I'm patient. All of us are patient. That's the badge of our tribe. We're patient. And so that's why I'm willing to lend you the money. So here Shakespeare has laid out, and it goes over 5 pages, patience and impatience. Okay, so then they get in an argument again about interest okay, so I forgot a slide. So the argument is Shylock tells a story. He says, even in the Bible, you say that it's unchristian to lend at interest. But don't you know the story in the Bible where Jacob was asked to perform a service in the field using his fields? Somebody wanted to use his fields for a while. And so Jacob said, okay, you can use my fields, but I have to charge you a fee. And the fee is going to be that however many spotted lambs are born, those are the ones that I get. And so it turned out that there was a huge number of spotted lambs. And so although Jacob had lent some of his sheep and his fields to the person who wanted them, he got back vastly more than he lent at the beginning. And so Antonio answers, well, this isn't interest, this is, this is a risk. Jacob got so much more because he took a risk. Who would have known how many lambs were going to be born? And so it's really, you don't really charge interest, you're just, you're an investor. So they haggle over this for a while, and they come to the conclusion that he's going to lend the money. And so what is the interest that they actually end up charging, the thing that Harold Bloom couldn't remember? Well, 0. Okay, I'll lend you the money and take no doit of usance for my monies. Not a single interest for my money. But they have to negotiate something else, something besides the rate of interest. They have to negotiate the collateral. And so they said, so they say, you know, go with me, blah, 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 and then let the forfeit be nominated. If you don't pay, let the forfeit be an equal pound of your fair flesh to be cut off and taken, and what part of your body pleaseth me. Now, the other half of there were 2 lectures by Harold Bloom. The second half of the first lecture was, what part of the body is he really talking about? And there seemed to be only two possibilities, but so the heart and another possibility, and Harold Bloom favored the second possibility. But anyway, it's collateral that they're putting up for the loan. So, okay, so there's collateral. So now what happens? So what we found is that Shakespeare has understood the impatience theory of interest. You've got an impatient borrower and a patient lender, and it's the trade-off between patience and impatience which is going to decide what the rate of interest is. So that's already Irving Fisher's biggest message. And then the second thing he's noticed, which Irving Fisher didn't notice at all, is that, and this is going to be a large part of the rest of the course, how do we know these people are going to keep their promises? Why is Antonio going to keep his promises? Well, it's because he's putting up collateral. And Antonio is stepping in for Bassanio because his collateral is worth more than Bassanio's. You know, Shylock wants his pound of flesh, not Bassanio's pound of flesh. So, all right, so that's the beginning, by the way. Just how does the play unfold? It gets more interesting. So what happens is after getting his money, Bassanio then goes to woo fair Porsha. And how does he woo her? Well, it turns out the way that her fabulously wealthy father has set up the marriage is there are 3 caskets, a gold one, a silver one, and a lead one. And he has to pick one. And one of them contains her picture, and if you get the one with her picture, you get to marry her. If you pick the wrong one, and here's the shocking thing, if you get the wrong one, you swear before you choose, if you choose wrong, never to speak to lady afterward in way of marriage. So not only don't you get Porsha, you don't get anybody. So what is the purpose of this absurd contract? Well, the purpose is maybe to make sure that people really want to marry her. Maybe the father set it up so that only someone who really wanted to marry her would bother to enter this competition because the risk is so high. But another way of saying it is it gives an excuse to Shakespeare to talk about risk and return and how, you know, people who have a higher risk are going to expect a higher return. And Morocco's, you know, so they talk about risk and return. And Aragon basically says she's really not, you know, she's not that good looking to justify such a high risk. But anyway, all those other guys pick the wrong casket, and Bassanio picks the lead one and gets her. And so, so she becomes the wife. Now, of course, she's delighted by this. He's the one she wanted all along. And so she says, let me give you this ring. And, you know, this is yet a third contract. The first contract is the loan of Shylock. The second contract is the choosing the caskets, and, you know, a contract that you won't marry again if you choose wrong. And now we have a third contract, which is Porsha deciding that she gives a ring to Bassanio. And she says, let this ring represent your love. And he says, when this ring parts from this finger, then parts life from hence. I'll never lose this ring. I'll never give it up. I love you so much. So, of course, the boats appear to sink, you know, calamity appears, my ships have all miscredited, you know, Shylock wants his collateral. So Porsha now, who turns out to be incredibly wealthy. So we realize, again, the play's not about love. She's beautiful, but she's fabulously rich, much richer than Shylock is, much richer than Tubal was. They had to scrounge around to get the 3,000 ducats. She hands 6,000 ducats, and then 12,000 ducats, then 36,000 ducats. Says, look, you know, offer Shylock all this money. You know, tell him, here, I've got the money. Tell him not to take his pound of flesh. So they hold a trial to decide whether Shylock should get his pound of flesh or not. And so Shylock, by this time, is incredibly pissed off at to say the least, at Antonio and Bassanio. And why is he so angry? Because, among other things, his daughter Jessica has run off with a Christian named Lorenzo and stolen his money. And so he yells, "My daughter, my ducats." And so she sells his, she sold his wife's ring for a monkey. And he said, or his ring that was given to him by his wife Leah. And he says, "I had it of Leah when I was a bachelor. I would not have given it for a wilderness of monkeys." So Shylock believes in keeping his promise. He would never have broken a promise. He never would have given away the ring that was given to him by his wife. He absolutely wouldn't do it. He believes in keeping promises, unlike everybody else in the play. His daughter, you know, everybody, as we'll see. So, another Lancelot says, "This making of Christians will raise the price of hogs." This Jewish girl Jessica has become a Christian, so now she's going to be able to eat pork, so it's going to increase the demand for pork and therefore raise the price of hogs. So Shakespeare, the play is full of economics. It's all about teaching economics. Okay, so anyway, they go to the trial, and Shylock thinks the guy's a complete fool. He doesn't understand interest. He doesn't understand the whole point of a marriage contract. I mean, not of a marriage contract, of a lending contract and getting interest. And basically he says, I got to skip over this a little quickly, he says, you know, we've got a contract. Your city, the greatest commercial city in the world at that time, can't possibly survive if you don't uphold contracts. So if you deny me fie upon your law, there is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. I stand for keeping promises, and the law is supposed to enforce promises. I stand for law, is what Shylock says. Now, at the trial, who turns out to be the judge? Well, Porsha has disguised herself as the judge, and she's actually the judge. And so she comes in and she has this famous line, "Who is the merchant here and which is the Jew?" So again, this confirms to me it's about economics. If it was about Judaism, it would be, who's the Christian and who's the Jew? She's saying, who's the borrower and who's the lender? That's how she comes in. And so then she says, you've got to show mercy. And this is the most famous line in the play, the quality of mercy, blah, blah. You all remember it, who've seen it. And he says, and then Bassanio says, look, I've got 6,000 ducats. I've got more than that. Take that. And he says, you know, a contract is a contract. You've humiliated me. All kinds of humiliations have happened to me. I've got feelings too. I've been humiliated. I want the contract. And the contract says that I should get the pound of flesh. And so Bassanio says, you know, to do a great right, do a little wrong. Okay, so, you know, let him default. And so, so what does Porsche say? What is the judgment? She has to play the judge. It seems like the whole city depends on enforcing contracts. And here it seems like a horrible thing to do. You're going to have to kill somebody. So what judgment can she possibly make? She says, well, the state has to enforce contracts, of course. Contracts have to be enforced. But only good contracts should be enforced. And so what's wrong with the contract? Does she say we're going to reduce what you owe from 3,000 to, you know, 1,500? Does she, you know, that's principal forgiveness? Does she say you don't have to, you know, what does she say? What she says is that what was wrong is the contract wasn't right. It wasn't the interest rate that was wrong. It wasn't the amount you owe that was wrong. It was the collateral that was wrong. So she says the right collateral was a pound of flesh, but not a drop of blood. And so the state intervenes not to change the interest rate, not to change the principal, but to change the collateral. Okay, so, all right, so that's going to turn out to be, you know, the leverage was wrong. And so the second, okay, so then the play ends with Bassanio asking the judge, he's so pleased that things have turned out right, if he can reward the judge. He doesn't know who the judge is. And he says, you know, I've got all these ducats that I've just gotten. You know, why don't I give you some of the ducats? And the judge says, well, no, I don't want the ducats, but I notice you've got this ring on your finger. Why don't you give me that? And, you know, he says, well, I can't do that. My Porsches, I've promised. And the judge says, well, you know, give it to me anyway. And he gives her the ring. And so the play finally ends with her revealing herself, and he's incredibly embarrassed that he's given her the ring. So this is another contract broken, another default, and then he says, but I'm never going to default again. And Antonio steps in and says, you know, I'll guarantee again that he'll never default again. And of course, we all know that he's going to default. Okay, so the whole play is just about contracts and breaking contracts and figuring. So at first it's about what the rate of interest should be, then it switches to should contracts always be enforced, and yes, they should be enforced, but the enforcement should be the taking of collateral, and sometimes the amount of collateral put up is wrong.